heard, I'm Christina Sanderson. I am a senior environmental studies major, and I want to look into how plants might have an impact on students' stress levels. But first, let's talk about how I got to this topic. So, why plants? I've always had a special interest in plants and the many special powers they seem to have. And they've always been around in my life, and they made me pretty happy, as you can see with me and my 3-year-old plant Eduardo cheesing on the side. This has made me wonder if other people had the same reactions to plants. So then I started to think about some common feelings people have towards plants and just nature itself. And that's when I started to realize most people relate plants and nature to serenity and calmness. So there seems to be something stress relieving about it. So I brought all of this knowledge together, and it pretty much led me into wanting to be an environmental studies major because I love plants so much and believe that all the different ways that they help me, and I want to help others see the ways that they can help them. So, if plants are so great, why don't we have them in more stressful areas, specifically in classrooms? So let's start off at the basics. It's no secret that college students are stressed, and we have been for a long time. But that's the problem. As if college students weren't already stressed, the COVID pandemic has added an entirely new level of stress. So not only do students have to learn how to handle a college workload, and then any other issues like familial, financial, social, or anything else, they now have to worry about getting sick at any second. So, to say the least, college students need opportunities to relieve stress, just any opportunity. So, all these questions and wonders brought me to my research question. Does connectedness to nature influence the benefits one receives from plants? Which will be tested through the bigger question of can plants being added to a classroom reduce college student stress? So since I kept questioning why plants weren't in more stressful areas, I decided to target my study into those areas, so classrooms. I also found stress to be kind of difficult to measure, so we switched that up into perceived stress levels to target specifically how students are feeling in their classroom. And then I found a confounding factor, which was one's connectedness to stress, because if depending on how connected a student feels towards plants, can change how impactful having plants in the classroom is. So what this all comes down to is how can we help college students be less stressed? So let's break down some of the things that we already know. So before diving into statistics on college student stress, we need to explore what stress does to people's health. Stress can be a normal everyday occurrence, or it can be a nuisance in life. Daily stress, otherwise known as distress, is manageable, normal, totally fine, but the problem comes when someone is under constant stress or chronic stress, which is a culmination of all these daily stressors that hits a point that the person can't handle healthily anymore. Chronic stress is dangerous enough on its own, but then when paired with acute stress, or when a stressor suddenly appears, it becomes extremely hazardous. Just a short interaction with a stressful event can produce many physical reactions such as headaches, elevated blood pressure, stomach aches, skin irritations, and more. But some of the long-term consequences, according to the American Institute of Stress, you can develop unhealthy coping habits, you have an enhanced risk of heart attack or stroke, and they overall weaken your immune system, thus leading to longer and more difficult recoveries. So these are all potentially fatal risks just if you're under constant stress. So now, when you apply this to college students, it becomes even scarier. College students have a multitude of stressors consistently acting in their lives. So they have their academics, any emotional, social, financial, or familial stress. And on top of this, recent college students also have the coronavirus to add to that. All of these stressors, plus the fact that many college students are still learning healthy coping habits, just lead to a dangerous situation. Built on another big problem that college students face is mental health. And according to one of my studies, students that were already struggling to find ways to feel safe and connected are struggling even more now and feel that it's impossible. And ever since the pandemic started, depression and anxiety have skyrocketed amongst college students. And this is kind of where I'm hoping that plants could come in to help. So let's build up a bit more knowledge into some theories that we have. So there are many theories that talk about how plants could significantly and positively impact humans' mental and physical health, but the most crucial to my research is the biophilia hypothesis. This hypothesis was coined by Edward O. Wilson in 1984, and he believed that humans have an innate connection towards plants, animals, and just natural processes in general. He attributes this to our evolutionary relationship with them, since for our entire existence we've developed on them, depended on them. So, according to this hypothesis, being near, around, or just seeing nature should make you feel better, or at least make you happier. And many studies have come to support this theory in their various experiments and found that it's stable. So this leads more into the next theory of nature having a restorative function. So restoration from nature is based around the idea that if someone interacts with nature, they should feel rejuvenated. For the physical side of this, studies have shown hospital patients with faster recovery rates just because their room has a view of a natural setting. For the mental side of this comes the attention restoration theory, which explains that interacting with nature can recover one's attention fatigue just by letting their mind engage with the surroundings without any extra effort. So these kind of effects have been seen in various studies, which we will go into now. So a culminative research by St. Leger in 2003 found a multitude of good things happening when people had a nice view of nature. So prisons had less sick days, offices had increased creativity and productivity, and as we mentioned earlier, hospital patients had increased recovery rates just because their rooms had nice views. Another study by Dadvand and others in 2018 tracked participants' residential areas and found that participants that had areas with more greenery had different brain changes. And these specific changes in their brain were connected with improved working memory and cognitive function and decrease in attentiveness. Another study done in 2018 by Sivaraja and others looked into schools' tree coverage rate and schools tree coverage and the students' academic performance. And they found that schools with more tree coverage had better academic skills, but then they found that schools with other external hardships like low-income areas, different ethnicity groups, or low socioeconomic statuses had even more drastic changes and more positive impacts. And then finally, the study that sparked my idea for this entire experiment was from Daly and others in 2010, and he conducted an experiment on elementary students. He added 3 plants into various classrooms among 4 different schools to see if they had any change on the students' academic performance. And he found that in every single school, except for one, there were significant changes and improvements in the students' academic performance. And the only school that there wasn't a change in had an active gardening program. So, once I learned all of this, I then started to question if it could also be impacting students' stress levels, since it seems to have a positive impact on their physical health and on their mental capabilities. So who would be interested in this kind of research? Well, once you break it down, of all the interested groups, the most directly connected to college students is the university or college itself. The administrators, teachers, and students all have direct ties to understanding student stress and are avidly working to lessen it. Past the school is the healthcare professionals, who are consistently working with college students to mitigate all the negative consequences their distress is causing. For this study, environmental experts would also be involved because they would be able to bring their knowledge in to help guide students or schools in purchasing and taking care of plants. And then finally, the building designers, which may seem like an odd group at first, but once you think about what their job is, they create spaces that are specifically supposed to invoke feelings. So they play integral roles into incorporating stress-relieving designs into buildings. So now that we have all this knowledge, let's build on it and see how I built my research. So to start off, With our basic procedure and outline of what I did, I first worked with the school's greenhouse to find and borrow 5 plants per classroom. Then I added those plants to certain classrooms, and then throughout this entire process, I was surveying my students. So let's break these down. I chose 4 different types of plants from the greenhouse to use in my plant rooms. I avoided flowering plants or anything that I believe could have allergic reactions or be too messy in the classrooms. So each planted room had one mother-in-law tongue, which is pictured on the right, the left, and then 2 dwarf mother-in-law tongues, which are pictured on the right. I thought this would attract the eye because one is really big and tall, and then the other just looked really healthy with all the different greens it had. Each plant room also had one spiderwort, pictured on the left, and one small ficus, pictured on the right. I also chose these 2 because of their different characteristics as a different color, and one looks like a tiny tree, real cute. So I was hoping all these different characteristics together would, really make students look around and notice the plants were there to start with, but then also, have some kind of feelings from them. So as I mentioned earlier, these were placed in specific rooms. So due to the COVID pandemic, classroom sizes were greatly reduced, causing certain rooms to be utilized much more than others due to space. I also wanted to choose rooms in pairs so that I could have an experimental and a control room of similar sizes and class sizes, so no other environmental factors could negatively impact my data. So the first 2 rooms I chose were in Woodson, since these rooms were the biggest and had a capacity of 24 students and 1 professor, and they were used almost every day, at almost every time. So our first room is Woodson 100A, which is one of our plant rooms, and plants were placed along the perimeter, so on the windowsills and by the sanitation. Next is Woodson 100C, so the mirror room, and this is our control room in this pairing. Note you can see the TV cart in this back picture on the right. That is how remote students interact with classrooms. So whatever they can see, that's where I need to put plants. The next used building without much difficulty in collecting data was Hudson, and specifically rooms on the first floor. So first off is Hudson 106, which you can see the desks are 6 feet apart to ensure social distancing during class, and I apologize for the left picture being blurry, but you could still see the room and how spacious it is. So keep in mind, Hudson rooms only hold 12 students and 1 professor, so the capacity has been cut down a bit. And then finally, we have Hudson 109, and this was our other experimental room, or our other plant room. All the plants in this room all the plants in all the rooms were intentional, so you could see them from the TV. But this also helped make the experiment quasi-experimental, because depending on the classroom students were in, they were able to self-designate what group they were in, either control or experimental. So now let's take a look at my survey. All of my data was collected through a survey that I sent to professors holding classes in the rooms I designated, and then it was up to them to forward that to their students. So the survey was sent out 3 times, so there was a pre-assessment, assessment, and a post-assessment. It was split into 3 different sections, starting with demographics, then into the perceived stress scale, and ending with the connectedness to nature scale. The demographics had questions directed just to collecting information about the individual participant, standing, residential status, and others. Then came the 10-item perceived stress scale. This was developed by Stephen Cohen, who just wanted to make an easily accessible scale that could pin where one's stress was coming from. The goal was to find how stressed a participant was while in the classroom itself in that moment. And then the next section is the 14-item connectedness to nature scale. This was developed by Meyer and Franz in an effort to, end quote, document an individual's affective, experiential connection to nature. So the intention behind using this scale was to gauge how connected one felt to nature at every step of the study. So this would show if their connectedness changed as plants were either brought into their room or taken out. So breaking my hypotheses down, my main hypothesis was that with the addition of plants, students' perceived stress levels would decrease while their connection to nature increased. Then, when plants were removed, the stress levels would increase and the connection to nature would decrease. I also expected that rooms with no plants would either have no change or would just increase with stress as the semester continued. So time to learn about our participants. I had 58 participants that vary in many different areas. So breaking down some demographics, this left bar graph is going into class standing that ranged from freshman to senior, and I even included professors just to see if they had any significant changes since they were interacting with plants as well. And it seemed like a lot of freshmen participated, even though there was a good range among everyone. And then the right graph breaks down the gender identity of my participants, and just a bit of a closer look. There was one person who identified as non-binary, 26 males, 30 females, and one who preferred not to say. So we have a pretty close to even split between male and female. On this, we have the left graph talking about residential status of participants. So a majority of them were residential, but residential and commuter students were able to come to class in person, whereas distance learners were only able to see what was shown through their TV cart. So I differentiated these to see if there were any differences in residents. And then the right graph is about participants in the classroom, and you can see there's more participation from classrooms in the Woodson area, but I attribute this to being Woodson has twice the capacity and like twice the usage than the Hudson rooms. And the last demographic, on the left we have the different kinds of classes that were just going on in my designated rooms. As you can tell, there were a lot of writing course participation and career participation. For the writing courses, there were over 5 writing courses that just happened to be held in these rooms, so that takes that one. And then for the career courses, the professor generously offered extra credit to the students that filled out the survey. And then on the right is a split of the participants in each group. So the group with no plants and the group with plants. So now it's time to analyze what we found. So the goal, because I wanted to track individual students and see how their stress and connectedness levels changed, I planned to run a repeated measures test so I could look at 3 points in time. But I was only able to run ANCOVA tests to compare 2 points in time. This was due to a participation issue among all the assessments. So here's a bar graph showing the participation I had. I only had 4 people who did all 3 assessments. So as you can see, there's a huge spike in those that only did the assessment or only did the pre-assessment. So this made it extremely difficult to track any changes among certain individuals, since not many had reoccurring submissions. So overall, the first survey had 18 responses, the second one had 43, and the final one had 6. So there's not much information that could have been pulled out of the post-assessment. But let's focus on what I could find. In our pre-assessment, when looking at stress, we can see that most of the responses are, around the 10 to 19 range, with an average at 15. A normal score for this scale is about 12 to 13, so college students are just a slight bit more stressed than average, according to this finding. There are some outliers, though, that were either extremely stressed or just not stressed at all. Then connectedness to nature in the pre-assessment. The average here is at 48, but you can see there's a large amount of people that are above that. 48 is in the more connected group, so a lot of the participants were fairly connected just in the pre-assessment. So moving into the assessment, when looking at stress levels, the plant classrooms on average had a higher were more stressed than non-planted rooms, which this is the complete opposite of what I was expecting to find. Wanted the planted rooms to be less stressed, but as you can see on the bar plot, the entire amount of data is even higher than the ones for no plants. So moving to the connectedness, the average connection to nature was lower in the room without plants than in the room with plants. So while the room with no plants did have a larger range, the overall average of the room with plants did have a higher connection, which, granted, I didn't find anything significant here, but it could be a bit attributed to the fact that they had 5 plants in their classroom. So moving in, we're still in the assessment, but we're now comparing in-person students to remote students. So the green side are the in-person and the brown are the remote. So we are first looking into their stress. So in both of the plant and non-plant rooms, remote students were much more stressed than the in-person students. So while I didn't find anything significant, it does show, or it could show that plants may have helped the ones in person, but like we can't say that it did for sure. It could also be the difference in residential status as well. And then moving into the connectedness, as you can see here, in the no plant room, the remote students are more connected to nature than the in-person students. Now, this just completely goes to whatever their personal experiences are with nature since they are remote. But in the plant room, the in-person students have a higher average of connection than the remote students, which can be attributed towards the fact that they did have plants in their room, but yet again, there was nothing significantly found here. But you could suspect that that may have happened. And as I mentioned earlier, the post-assessment had 3 questions at the end of it, so only those that were in the plant rooms were able to end. So 5 out of 6 of the post-assessment responses were from plant rooms. 3 out of 5 of these responses didn't notice the plants at first, but all 5 said they liked them. There was an open-ended question that asked them to explain how they felt about having plants in the classroom, and on the slide there are the responses. So the first 2 have like some hint of they enjoyed them and they found them cozy, homey, or cool, but really 3 of them didn't really show much of an opinion towards the plants being there. So I believe it's safe to assume that people enjoy having plants around, but they aren't really able to see what benefits their interactions could be gaining them. In the end, my data was inconclusive. This was due to my participation issue, since the data was so spread out or condensed into one assessment, nothing can be determined and no test came back significant. But I did learn a lot about a few things and found even more for those pursuing this research and things that they should look out for. So starting in my limitations, the first limitation, and honestly the biggest one, was the COVID pandemic. I believe the pandemic really put a strain on my research and the ability to conduct my experiment. Throughout the entire research, I talked about how much strain COVID has put students on and how much stress they endure. My study could have been too intensive for students' mental capacity in this time of the year. On top of that, a third of my participants were remote, so when placing plants in the rooms, I had to try to predict where the camera would be showing, and that wasn't always possible considering professors can move them as much as they want. Additionally, some of the classes that were scheduled in these classrooms went fully remote before I even started my research, and some classes would weekly not be in person, and that sometimes may have landed on my survey weeks. So this all added up into a big time crunch on my experiment, where I wanted it to last about a full month so students could really have a significant amount of time with the plants in their room. But because of the condensed semester, that wasn't possible, and they were only in the rooms for about a couple weeks. I'd like to believe that if students had more time, the results would be more significant. Another limitation I faced was that my surveys went to the professors, so it was up to them to send to my students. Granted, this was a mistake on my end during my IRB application, but I do believe that direct contact with the students would have helped participation a lot. So throughout the study, I had to just hope that every professor was sending the email, and additionally, some professors were sending them and giving time in class and encouraging students to participate. And this was very much so appreciated, but also not a standard, so it did create a bit of a disproportionate chunk in my data. All of these difficulties led to my biggest problem that I had, which was participation. So ultimately, if all the responses were spread out among the three assessments, I would have had a better understanding, but the main thing I needed was repeated participation. But for the statistical test to even work, I needed 30 people in each assessment, which, as you heard, did not happen. So that's something for in the future to anticipate and plan for, as to how to make sure responders continue to complete surveys. So even though I had many difficulties, there were still things that I learned. So it's no lie that students are stressed and have always been stressed and will continue to be stressed. So we need to find ways, even if they're small, to relieve some of the stress. Targeting the most stressful places, such as classrooms or study spaces, are important in improving students' learning capabilities, and I do believe that plants could be a huge help in this. There seems to be a gap in studies in looking into what plants would be best for relieving stress, so since I avoided flowering plants, and 4 out of 5 of my plants were green, there could be something else missing. If flowering plants are more impactful, or if certain colors are important, that would have been important to incorporate. Previous research still does demonstrate that plants are doing amazing things for human physical and mental health. And I am a strong believer in the biophilia hypothesis and want to see more research behind how this hypothesis could be used for students and to better their time in college. So this area of research has many advancements to still make, but I'm excited to see where it goes and how it might change our learning environments. Before I finish, I'd like to give a special thanks to everybody who helped me with my research, including all of my participants. So thank you to all the professors who shared out my surveys and all the students for taking them. And a big thank you to Dr. Wheelocker, who has greatly helped me throughout this study and reassured me at every step that at some point I would finish. And here I am, so thank you. Thank you for listening. I'll be taking questions now, but if you're interested in gathering any more information or have bigger questions than we have time for, my email is here.